Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Bryce Duskett and thank you for joining us today on Market Journal. Harvest rolls on across the region. The U.S. Department of Agriculture came out with data to start this week that shows that producers had harvested about 34% of the Nebraska corn crop. The Nebraska soybean harvest was estimated at 54% complete. Coming up on today's show, we'll be discussing wheat variety selections. We'll also take a look at how the Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory is creating the ranch of the future. We'll get to those stories here in a moment, but first. The month of October can be a good time to do some soil sampling. If you happen to notice any areas in your soybean fields with unexplained yield loss, one potential explanation could be a case of Soybean Cyst Nematode. This pest is the #1 yield-limiting agent of soybeans in North America and is estimated to cause over $1 billion in losses each year. We recently caught up with Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Dylan Mangel to discuss checking for pests and the mitigation options.
The Soybean Cyst Nematode is the invisible yield parasite. It causes U.S. producers about $1.5 billion a year in yield loss. So it's the #1 yield-limiting biotic agent of soybeans. And the reason this is so damaging is because the parasite can cause up to 30% yield loss without any noticeable above-ground symptoms. So for this reason, a lot of producers don't know they have SCN and are not actively managing it in their fields. Now there's a couple ways to see if you have SCN in your fields. The first is digging up plants, but oftentimes when you dig up plants, there'll be very minor, very small structures on there called cysts from the Soybean Cyst Nematode. Those are very difficult to identify, and oftentimes the act of digging, they'll fall off, so you won't see them on there. So it's not a reliable way to know if you're losing yield to Soybean Cyst Nematode. The second and most reliable way is soil testing. And fortunately, now's a great time to soil test because it's the end of a soybean season, and that's when cyst numbers are going to be at their highest levels in the soil. When they're at these high levels, it makes them much easier to identify with soil testing. And now's a great time to soil test as well because the Nebraska Soybean Board, in partnership with Nebraska Extension and the Department of Plant Pathology, has funded a grant to provide free soybean cyst nematode soil testing for any Nebraska producer who would like to submit samples. So if you're interested in testing for soybean cyst nematode, the first thing you want to do is take a soil probe or a soil spade and sample dirt from the top 8 inches of the soil in the root zone of your soybean field. After harvest is fine as well. The best place to test for soybean cyst nematode initially is areas of potential introduction. So those might be areas where you're experiencing unexplained low yield, or areas on a floodplain that have been flooded and experienced low yield afterwards, as well as field entrances. Because this is a soil-borne pathogen, we're dragging it ourselves from field to field as we move soil working equipment around. When you're soil sampling, you want to collect about 20 or 25 soil probes of soil, put them in a bucket from across the field that you'd like to test, and mix those soil probes around with each other so you get a good mixture of the soil from that field. You can then take that soil, put it into a soil sample bag, and send that in to the university for testing. If you'd like to request free soil sample bags, you can do so by visiting our website at go.unl.edu/scnsample. And those bags can be directly shipped to you. So after testing, if you do find that you have a field that has SCN in it, there are many management options available. The first thing we recommend for management is selecting a resistant soybean variety. There's several resistant sources available, and you can talk to your local advisors to see which one would work best in your field. We also recommend rotating through different non-host crops in your rotation. Fortunately, in Nebraska, corn is a non-host crop, so you can rotate with a corn-soybean rotation, and while that won't solve the problem, it will help decrease the amount of SCN in your soils. The third recommendation is to pair that resistant variety with a nematode protectant seed treatment. There's several new seed treatments entering the market. Again, work with your local advisors and find one that's got a good history in your area. And the last recommendation is to continue testing. Because we can't see this pest, the best way to make sure your management is working is to test and make sure those SCN numbers are decreasing from previous measurements. If you've never tested your fields for soybean cyst nematode, or you don't remember the last time you've tested, now is time to test again. And again, this is the perfect time to do it with renewed funding from the Nebraska Soybean Board that provides testing for any Nebraska producers.
As you heard Dylan mention, you can collect one of those sample bags for free at your local extension office. If you'd like more information on soybean cyst nematode and the management options, you can find everything you're looking for at the website cropwatch.unl.edu. Next up, we're taking a look back to our most recent trip out to Whitman, Nebraska at the Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory. Since the inception of that research facility in the early 1980s, research and educational programs have become more diverse and team-oriented. This has resulted in several advancements in range livestock nutrition, reproduction, and grazing systems, just to name a few. We were fortunate enough to get a closer look at how the researchers continue to push range livestock production into the future. Market Journal's Bill Dodd brings us this story.
At the Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory, the ranch of the future is a reality in the here and now. It's often been said that necessity is the mother of invention. So when it comes to precision feeding and grazing, new technology is an inevitable step for many cattle producers, and the team here at Gudmundsen are finding out just how these new technologies can benefit producers in terms of range management, input costs, and overall profitability. One new technology being tested here is virtual fencing.
And virtual fencing is a tool that essentially is similar to what you might put on a dog to keep it in your yard. It uses GPS to see where that cow's at, and you're able to create fences on a laptop or a computer that would then keep those cattle within a defined area that you could move frequently. And so we're conducting some research looking at how that might be applicable within a grazing system in the Sandhills. So it's a collar that fits around the neck of the animal, and it gives a sound audio cue when those cattle come up to a line, a user-defined line, and that's as a warning. And if they keep moving on to that, it'll give them a mild shock. And what we found is it's fairly effective, that once cattle learn that behavior, learn what those signals are telling them, they quickly associate that sound with, okay, this is where I need to stop. And so we're looking at how this affects some of the behavior of cattle, and better understand how this can be used in a larger operation to really manage grazing. And so really thinking about how do we keep cattle away from areas they may graze too much, and maybe put them in areas where they may not like to graze as much, and to help provide a little bit more targeted, strategic type grazing on a landscape.
As far as investing in this type of technology now, the total input cost and savings producers could see with this type of investment haven't quite been determined by the researchers as of yet. However, they have already observed many benefits in both pasture management and labor reductions.
You know, it's really, we're not quite there yet, because it's just kind of getting out of that research phase, I would say. You know, it's just barely becoming commercially available. But we'll learn more in terms of understanding that cost and benefit relationship. The big thing is can it equate to more grazing days? You know, with better distribution, better utilizing the resource, that's probably a benefit, and it cuts down on labor too. You don't need to be out there putting electric fence or other fences in, and it allows some more labor savings in that way.
While grazing and pasture management are crucial for cattle producers, there's still the issue of feed. Getting optimal distribution among the herd can sometimes be tricky, as some cattle can be more aggressive or timid when it comes to feeding. Enter the Smart Feeder. This tag-based feeding system will ensure that each cow will get the necessary intake for targeted gains.
You know, if I'm feeding a group of cows in a pasture, say there's 100 cows in that pasture, and I'm feeding at some rate of, say, 1 pound per day, I'm going to have boss cows or aggressive cows that will be eating 4 or 5 pounds of that. And I'm going to have cows that do not eat any of it. So you have a wide range in responses from that. And it's really not a uniformed way to supplement cows across that, because of the behavioral component of aggressive cows and timid cows. And so one way around that is using technologies like this. And so, you know, if you think about our feed costs in beef production, our cow-calf production, you know, a lot of those in a total production system costs, they make up somewhere around 65% of total costs. And so much of that could be tied up to, I've got cows that are eating way too much and cows not getting anything. And so this feeder right here works off an electronic EID in a cow's ear. So a cow will walk up to it, it registers who that cow is, and they're programmed per cow that, let's say I want to feed 1 pound per day. And so that cow with the EID walks up and knows who it is, and it'll start dropping feed for that cow slowly and allowing that cow to eat. And you know, the focus is really, can I refine my cost of my supplementation by utilizing some of these technologies that give me that precision to control some of those costs much better than we had before of feeding in bunks or feeding out on pastures, etc.
With the integration of new technologies and ranch economics in several areas of research conducted at this facility, Gudmundsen has become an invaluable part in creating plant and animal production systems that aim to make future ranch practices even more economically and environmentally sustainable to the Sandhills region of Nebraska. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thank you for that story, Bill. If you'd like to learn more about the research and the advancements being made at the Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory, we've included an informative link along with this story. You can find them both on the Market Journal website. What is time now to shift our attention over to the grain markets. Joining us this week was Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag. We had the opportunity to catch up with Luke on Wednesday afternoon following the release of the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates report. That's where we began the conversation with Luke. Let's talk about the big report that came out here on Wednesday, crop production and WASDE estimates. What numbers stuck out from you from those reports?
Well, the surprise today, Bryce, was the soybean production number. Yield got cut on the soybeans. Came in 1/2 bushel lower than where the market expected, and really allowed the carryout in beans to stay unchanged. Market was looking for something closer to 250 million bushels on the soybeans, and it stayed unchanged at 200. And so the combination of the smaller crop and offsetting demand adjustments in some capacity allowed the carryout to not increase and allowed beans to have a higher finish today.
You mentioned the soybeans. What did you see on the corn front?
Corn side was fairly routine. We did see the smaller crop with a 0.6 of a bushel yield cut. And then you had the offsetting demand adjustments with your ethanol and your feed use. And we did expect, corn export demand to get cut. We had that stocks report in late September that really forecasted that, this crop was smaller coming in. Our carryout was smaller coming in. So we knew that demand was going to have to be cut just because those carryout numbers are getting too tight. USDA wasn't going to print something sub 1 billion bushels. And so it's the market's job at this point to really make sure those demand numbers come to fruition. And at the end of the day, that means that we need to ration demand in some capacity. So price is the vehicle in which that happens. So we'll have to see how, the cash market and other things behave to see where it gets rationed.
Luke, of course, those are the USDA national numbers here in Nebraska where you and I sit and have this conversation today. USDA projecting 172 for corn and 49 bushels an acre for soybeans. That's a big decrease as compared to what we saw last year, isn't it?
Yeah, 11% cut in the corn down to 172. Fairly sizable, but, for the type of summer that we had, I think it's certainly conceivable. In soybeans, at least in percentage terms, a larger cut of 22% down to 49. And so, those numbers probably wouldn't surprise, the Nebraska producer or anybody in the Western Corn Belt. As you look across the country, though, really some good crops in other parts of the Eastern Corn Belt for sure. Iowa is a little bit split with the western side of the state being drier, but the East doing really well. So we tend to have some backyarditis as we look out the window and look at, tough crops that are maybe disappointing to us in some capacity, but we have to remember there are better bushels, better crops outside of us, specifically to the east and northeast.
When it comes to the Western Corn Belt, Luke, you described the cash market as on fire. What's your take here on those cash markets and any predictions you want to make as we continue through the harvest season?
Yeah, really the setup for this was a tight pipeline or an empty pipeline coming in. We really coasted into harvest on fumes. And demand has been robust. We haven't been able to ration demand over the last year. And so a lot of your consumptive users are still hungry to buy bushels, source bushels, find bushels, just to continue to either process it or feed it to livestock. And so, with a local crop that hasn't been able to recharge the pipe as quickly as we want to, you've really seen a strong cash inverse carry forward into what would typically be what we call gut slaughter, the middle of harvest. And so we really haven't seen that basis pressure. We haven't seen, consumptive users or elevators feel comfortable with, the bushels that are out there. And so you've seen historically strong basis values in the Western Corn Belt. And we probably expect that to continue from the historical norms through this balance of this calendar year.
With those things said, Luke, it makes for some challenging considerations when it comes to what to do, storage, and the economics that come to play with that. What would you like to share with our viewers about that today?
Well, Bryce, we've been receiving a lot of those questions. The futures price is really attractive. The basis is the best it's ever been for this time of year, at least recently. And so you're dealing with cash corn, right around $7 in a lot of locations, and soybeans on either side of $14. And so we've had producers asking the question, what am I doing putting a $7 commodity in the bin, or should I do that? And so I think it's important for producers to consider the economics of that decision. And the biggest one associated with that is your opportunity cost. And, if you think about bushels that are in a bin, they can sit there as bushels, or you can take those, to a market of some kind and turn them into dollars. And so that opportunity cost is interest. And so if you take a $7 commodity and apply, today's market rate of interest, it's going to cost you 4 cents per bushel per month to store that corn crop on your farm, whether the bin's paid for or not. So that's a variable cost component to that decision. And so if you're going to store that crop for 6 months, you need to keep that in mind in terms of, what will it cost me? What do I need to see basis and spreads appreciate by to justify that decision? Because there are alternatives to keeping your price open besides storing the grain physically on farm. You could take it to market right out of the field. You could sell it and re-own it. Otherwise, basis contracts are offered at most all destinations. That's another way to physically push corn into the pipeline, but keep your futures price open. And so producers need to think through those, work with your advisor to consider what the best alternative for you might be, and understand that there is a cost with putting grain on farm, even if those assets are paid for.
All right, Luke, I'll give you the final word this week. Just a few seconds left. What do you want to leave us with this week?
Continue to focus on your numbers, focus on 2023. We know those prices are lagging the current crop. They've been that way for several years with this inverse that we have. So as you make fertilizer and seed decisions this fall for the 2023 cycle, put those budgets together, get an idea of where those break-evens are, because there's probably some profitable opportunities that you can take today to cover what are historically high input prices.
We appreciate Luke taking the time out of his schedule to join us this week. Now, coming up next week, we'll be joined by Todd Holtman from DTN. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask Todd, feel free to email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll be sure to pass your question along. Well, Michael Hodges is one of 12 Nebraska Berkshire hog producers who is part of Berkwood Farms. It is a pork cooperative of around 78 independent hog producers that is based in Des Moines. Comprised of small independent producers, this producer-owned cooperative markets pork through direct-to-consumer selling and also to high-end restaurants and urban grocery stores. You can learn more about the Nebraska pork producers who are part of this cooperative in the October issue of the Nebraska Farmer. Well, it is time now for weather with Nebraska Extension ag climatologist and Market Journal chief meteorologist Al Dutcher. Well, Al, some parts of southeast Nebraska saw some rain in the middle parts of the week. Certainly won't complain about the moisture, but as we look to the coming week, how are things shaping up?
Well, Bryce, we did have that cold front come through during the midweek period that dropped some thunderstorm activity across southeastern Nebraska. But as you move to the wet north and northwest of there, the precipitation total dropped off pretty significantly. Most locations less than 1/10 of an inch, and to be honest with you, the northwestern half of the state less than basically zero. We had zero precipitation. Southeast Nebraska, anywhere from 1/4 to 3/4 of an inch was common. There were a few isolated pockets around the 1-inch mark. Some welcome moisture, but unfortunately not enough to have any major drought-breaking concerns. We've had to deal with wind, and we're likely to deal with wind and cooler conditions as we go through this next 7-day period, as we're dealing with an upper air trough over the Great Lakes region. So if we go to the upper air model, This morning we see that upper air low parked over the western Great Lakes, bringing cold air off in the upper atmosphere into a region that will reinforce surface temperatures. So we're going to remain consistently in the low to mid 60s across much of eastern Nebraska, and we'll be pushing the upper 60s to low 70s across the southwest and the southern panhandle. As we go into Sunday, basically we see a northerly flow as this trough broadens out. That's going to bring a reinforcing shot of cool air. Most likely the most impacted will be northeast Nebraska, but that should still consistently keep us into the mid to upper 60s, and we'll see mid 70s potential from western Nebraska. On Monday, this trough kind of slides a little bit toward the southeast. That allows a little bit warmer area into our region, so we should see temperatures in the mid 70s west, maybe even an isolated 80 in the southwest, and we'll be pushing the low 70s across the east. On Tuesday, now the system kind of drops down toward the south. We have the blocking high pressure system not allowing the trough to come into the west, so much warmer conditions move into western Nebraska. Would not be surprised we'll see mid 70s to even low 80s. And in eastern Nebraska, we're pushing into the low to mid 70s. Now, as we get into the midweek period, we start to see this low pressure system trying to make a move toward the east, but there's another piece of energy coming on the backside that may reinforce this. That's the uncertainty of forecast of the second half of the week. This moves out quicker, then we don't see this trough impacting us, but overall, we're expecting to see some fairly benign conditions, maybe a little clouds in eastern Nebraska, no precipitation, temperatures consistently holding in the 70s across the east, up to the upper 70s, low 80s across the west. On Thursday, here comes that piece of energy that's going to pivot around this low. That will start to bring cooler air in, particularly as we get into Friday. So we will see one more day of fairly decent temperatures, mid to upper 70s west, low to mid 70s across the east. And as we get into the day on Friday, here comes that cold air to reinforce us once again with a cooling trend, probably dropping a good 5 to 10 degrees. Doesn't look like much precipitation associated with the system, but we'll have to pay attention to see whether the models change on this. Looking farther out in the future, next Thursday is the following Tuesday. Above normal temperatures with that high pressure system in place, and this will likely stay this way until that upper air trough finally moves off toward the east. In terms of precipitation, upper low comes into the western United States. So we are going to see an increase in precipitation. At some point, we'll start to see this move out in the plains, but right now it doesn't look until it will be at least the 22nd or later for our region.
Thank you for the information, Al. With many producers focusing on planting wheat this time of year, we wanted to take a look back to this year's second annual Southeast Nebraska Alfalfa and Wheat Expo. We got a rundown of some of the event happenings from Nebraska Extension educator Nathan Mueller and got his take on what Nebraska wheat producers should be looking for in their wheat varieties that they select. Market Journal's Mike Straub has the story.
The Southeast Nebraska Alfalfa and Wheat Expo had its second annual program in Crete, Nebraska the first week of September. Several UNL Extension educators were there to share their expertise and answer questions.
This is the second annual Southeast Nebraska Alfalfa and Wheat Expo. It's a great program that focuses on wheat in the morning, alfalfa in the afternoon, and intermixed with a little bit on cattle production in there because most growers that have alfalfa and wheat also have cattle in their operation here in Southeast Nebraska. So just thanks to our sponsors that made the program possible and free to our attendees. Well, we had about 40 growers in the room, this morning here in Crete for the Alfalfa and Wheat Expo. I talked about winter wheat variety selection, which is the first critical management decision that growers make each year. Can inflict 10 to 20 bushel yield difference. So the big takeaways were, obviously we're selecting for yield, test weight, and protein, because those are quality things that affect price at the elevator. But in terms of other traits, we're looking for resistance both to lodging, so standability, as well as some disease resistance, particularly Fusarium head blight, stripe rust, and leaf rust. So I talked a lot about Fusarium head blight and then selecting what varieties do we have adapted to our region, perform well for yield, and have moderately resistance to Fusarium head blight. And so that was really the takeaway from the talk this morning, to help growers make that decision for planting this fall.
Especially in southeast Nebraska, excess moisture can lead to some disease in alfalfa, leading to lower yields.
Here in eastern Nebraska, we're on definitely the eastern fringe of the hardwood winter wheat belt, where usually excess moisture during May and June can lead to some disease issues, and that's why I focused on Fusarium head blight. So you need variety selection and a well-timed fungicide at flowering to really protect that plant and our yield and price from Fusarium head blight infecting that plant during flowering. So that was a big one. In terms of drought resistance, it's probably not as high on my list as it would be further west. But this year in mind, we did talk a little bit about planting conditions, whether we should delay planting if we don't get moisture. The main thing is we really want growers to get that seed in the ground a good 1.5 inches for a depth so that way we don't run into some winter kill or standability issues. So again, target depth of 1.5 inches, target planting date. Ranges in southeast Nebraska kind of from October 1st to October 15th, ranging from north to south in eastern Nebraska.
Good genetics and fungicide treatment can help manage high disease pressure situations.
Since we want to match the traits and those winter wheat varieties for our common diseases that we have, so start off with good genetics and then add fungicides on top of that to help manage high disease pressure situations. So I talked about the varieties that I thought had a good disease package for stripe rust, leaf rust, and fusarium head blight. That's what I focused on. There was about 6 varieties, and then we have some new ones that will be in the UNL variety trials evaluated by Cody Creech and Amanda Easterly across the state. So I talked about two new ones that growers could look for new results coming forward.
Eastern Nebraska has a great group of varieties that fit the production practices of this part of the state.
So on average, if you look at variety trial results across Nebraska, the average yield difference could easily be 15 bushel difference, in commonly planted varieties. And so that's a big difference. And so my job as a local agronomist is kind of to help growers make those local selections of what's a good fit for our area. What do we have for local variety trial results, which is done by UNL. So complementing data-driven decisions with observations from growers that have grown some of these varieties, and then I'm kind of the go-between. So I had some good questions on varieties, and I think we're in a much better place in eastern Nebraska than we were 10 years ago. We have a good group of varieties that really fit our production practices here in southeast Nebraska.
Thanks for that story, Mike. If you'd like to learn more about the wheat variety selection for your area, you can try the Wheat Variety app. This web-based application will allow you to easily view variety selections with multiple options when it comes to filtering and customizing results on different levels. We've included a link for more information about the web-based tool along with this story on the Market Journal website. Well, that is all the time we have for this week's show. As a reminder, the Market Journal crew is on social media. You can follow us on Twitter and on Instagram for more content throughout the week. You can also see bonus videos when you subscribe to Market Journal on YouTube. Until next time, I'm Bryce Duskett, wishing you a safe and productive week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.